Hello class and welcome back. Today we are going to continue looking at the European theater and we're going to look at military intelligence, D-Day, and the post-war peace plans. So today let's start with British intelligence, or the reason that James Bond is so awesome. Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond novels, which would then be turned into movies, worked for British intelligence during World War II. So his insight into the world of spycraft and intel is due to his personal experience. So we're going to focus on just a few key stories. The first being July in 1941, a man named Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked the Enigma code. Now, Enigma was a machine, pictured here and here, that was used by the Germans to encode messages to be sent around the empire, the Reich, during this time. The way it would work is you would put in a key and it would switch the letters, so kind of a substitution cipher. So when you try to type hello, instead of the H, every time there was an H, you'd put in a P. And every time there was an E, they'd put in an O. And every time there was an L, they'd put in an F, right? And so the person at the other end of this transmission, you get to type on your machine, pressing the buttons like you normally would. But the machine, when it prints it out, is going to send a message that will spit out this kind of random looking assortment of letters. Instead of hello, it'll say P-O-F-F, whatever. And then the person on the other end would take that what looked like a random assortment of letters, and they would type it into their machine, and they would hit P-O-F-F, and it would pop up H-E-L-L-O, right? And so you would encode and decode as long as you had the cipher key. Those types of ciphers aren't super hard to crack if you have enough time, because you can figure out based on patterns what letters are more likely to stand for other letters. You know, you need to have a certain number of vowels and things like that. However, the Germans would change these codes every day. And so by the time the Allies would crack one of the codes, it would be a week out of date. Right? And they could not keep up with real-time intel, which is what they needed to fight this war. So what winds up happening is that a man named Alan Turing comes up with a machine called the Turing machine that can run through a bunch of different possibilities for what each letter might be standing in for. But even with that, there's just too many possibilities. I mean, it's 26 letters. Each letter has 25 possible substitutions. Of course, there's also the possibility that an H really just is an H. So it's like a 26 factorial, 26 times 25 times 24 times 23, so on down the line. So this, even with this machine, it's too much to go through to crack it in time. And so what they figured out using his team is that the German transcripts always had two words included in them. Those two words were always Heil Hitler. So knowing that they could count on that phrase to be in the same place in every message, they were able to eliminate a bunch of possibilities. If you always know that Hail Hitler is going to be in there, then you know that you're looking for that phrase. And so with that limiting their searches, the possible combinations of letters, then the machine was able to start cracking this. So Alan Turing didn't do this on his own. He had a team of mathematicians and engineers and code breakers, including a woman named Mavis Beatty, who I include here so that you can see, again, women are an important part of this war effort. There's an excellent movie called The Imitation Game, which last I checked was on Netflix. It might be on another streaming service at this point, but I highly recommend you watch it. It's not the most accurate version of history. They take some liberties with the characterization of the people involved, but overall, the historical events are generally accurate, and it does tell a very compelling story that was unknown really until much later. Alan Turing himself was a gay man. He was arguably one of the most important people in the British war effort, but nobody knew him because this was all top secret classified work. And so after World War II in the 1950s, he gets arrested for trying to pick up a member of the same sex, so trying to go on a date with a member of the same sex. And he is given the choice of jail time or what's called chemical castration, where basically you can take pills that will make it so that you're not interested in having a romantic or sexual relationship with anybody. And so he opts for the chemical castration, and it messes with your brain chemistry, and it makes him horribly depressed, and he ultimately kills himself in this real national tragedy. But Britain didn't even know that this was one of their major World War II heroes. I mean, only a few people with top-level security clearance knew who he was, because this had to be done extremely secretly. So his is a tragic story. His name doesn't even come out until like the 1990s that we know about him and the work that his team did as a public. So this brings me, the reason I'm mentioning this secrecy that surrounds it, and even the people involved in it aren't well known as British heroes for 50 years after they've done this, is because of the nature of the problem that is facing the society. So let's say you've cracked a code, right? This is what's called the Coventry problem. You've cracked a code. You can read the German military movements. You can read their secret communications because you know what these memos are saying now, these telegrams. But you now know if there's going to be an attack. In this case, it was an attack planned on the town of Coventry. What do? Do you warn the people of Coventry? If you warn the people of Coventry, you could save hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. But as soon as you warn the people of Coventry, and the Germans find out that you've warned the people of Coventry, which they will find out because the death toll won't be as high as they expect, there are German spies around the country, so they will pass this information back. They will know that you have cracked the code, and they will change it. They will change the machine, they will change the way they go about encoding things, and you'll be back at square one again. So, do you sacrifice these people's lives for a later date when hopefully this information will come in more handy? Or do you save the people's lives now and then deal with the future in the future? Well, in this case, they did not tell the people of Coventry that an attack was happening, and over 1,000 people were casualties in that attack. So the British chose to keep this a secret. And they will continue to keep this a secret well after the end of World War II, which is why Alan Turing is not known as a hero until after the 1990s, and really until the movie gets made. Because what if England and Germany wind up at war in the future? Well, the Germans, if they think their codes haven't been cracked, will continue to use them, and so the British will have an advantage. So it makes sense why they've kept this secret. However, it does come at the cost of people's lives that could have been saved. It may be saving other people's lives in the future, definitely, but this is the kind of moral quandary problem that you're facing. So in this period, because the British have cracked this code, they're able to find out who the German spies are. Not only troop movements and plans, but who the actual spies are, who's a double agent, etc. And they won't know until after the war whether they found all the German spies. But it turns out they had. After they conquer Germany and they get a hold of the list of and the records of who was acting as a spy for Germany, they found out that they had actually identified every single German spy. That said, the question is, okay, let's see, you think you've got a bunch of German spies, and you know who they are. You might not know that you have all of them, but you've got a whole bunch that you are sure are German spies. Okay, well, what do you do with that information? You could just stop passing them intelligence at all. Make sure they don't get any information about what the British government is doing. But if you do that, then again, the Germans are going to know that you figured out who their spies were, and they'll just recruit new spies. And if you figure those out, they'll probably figure out you've cracked their code. So what do? Do you keep passing them good information? Well, if you do that, you're giving up your secrets. But if you pass them all bad information, again, the Germans are going to know all their spies are burned. So what they do is they divide the list in half. And half of them, they pass false information. And half of them, they pass accurate information. Right? And so as these reports keep coming in to headquarters in Berlin, the German Nazis government believes that half of their spies are still good spies and they're getting good information, and that the other half have been found out, right? Not that they're disloyal, but that the British have figured out that they're spies, and so that's why the British is giving them bad information. So they don't pull them off the field, but they are not trusting information from that half of their spies. Well, in gearing up for an invasion of France, right? The British and the Americans are gearing up for an invasion of France. This will be called D-Day. They're going to have to amass troops. And the Germans are going to see this. They're flying over Britain, air assaults, reconnaissance missions. They're going to see these troops being built up. So they know an invasion is coming. And the question is where and when. There's two particular points that it would make sense to invade. Either Calais, which is an easy shot to Paris, and it's a short hop across the English Channel, or Normandy. This is tougher. Some of these, there are beaches here, but some of them are on rough cliff faces. The terrain's a little rugged, and it's a bit longer to get to Paris. So, where are the Allies going to invade? Well, those of you who know history know that they will invade in Normandy. But the Germans aren't sure. And they're watching these troop buildups. Now, the Allies are very clever, and they are also trying to make it look like they're going to invade in the place where they're not. So they're trying to make it look like there's more troops here ready to invade Calais than over here. They do this in a couple of ways. They, first of all, get big, giant balloon tanks that are like those kind of, almost like those big play bouncy houses that you might have been in. But it's a big balloon that you put one soldier inside, and you have him just kind of slowly walk around at the speed of a tank. So it looks like there's a tank from way up above, where the German reconnaissance flyovers are seeing it. They can't see a lot of detail. They just see something that looks like a tank slowly moving around. So you got troops in these tanks pretending to be tanks over here, when actually your real tanks are over here. And then the soldiers here are told to buddy up and sleep 4 soldiers to a tent. So it looks like there are fewer tents and therefore fewer soldiers here. And then over here, each soldier's given their own tent, so it looks like there's way more soldiers over here. So the Germans are looking at this thinking, okay, it looks like the more troop movement, more buildup is happening to go into Calais. And then the British give information to the troops, or to the spies, who had been giving the Germans good information, saying we're going to invade in Calais, which lines up with everything the Germans think they're seeing. And again, these are the trustworthy spies. They're the ones who've been consistently passing along good information. Over here, on the other side, they give the information about us, the Allies invading Normandy, to the spies that the Germans had stopped listening to because they thought that those spies had been found out and their information was typically wrong. And so the Germans figure, okay, this is business as usual. These spies that have been told wrong information repeatedly are being told that the Allies are going to invade in Normandy, so we're going to discount that. We're not going to listen to them. And we're going to listen to the spies that say we're going into Calais because they've been more reliable, and this is where we see the troop movements. So the Germans are sending their reinforcements to Calais when, in fact, the United States and Great Britain will be invading into Normandy, right? And Canada. Canada will be invading too. This is key to D-Day success. There will be fewer reinforcements on these beaches. There will be an easier path to Paris, although it will be by no means be easy, but it would have been much harder and much worse if the Germans had known to expect an invasion here. This is also another example of misinformation, is where you have the British strap a briefcase, handcuff a briefcase to a corpse that they put on a plane and dump it out of basically off the coast of Spain. And it's dressed in a uniform to make it look like it's a Spanish citizen. And because Spain is militarily neutral, they believe. I'm sorry, they're not in a Spanish uniform. They're the person that is. Okay, sorry. So the body that they dump out is just a regular British corpse, and it's dressed as a British intelligence officer, but it is dumped off the coast of Spain because the Spanish are neutral, but they're fascist. So the Germans are willing to believe that the Spanish are going to give them good intel. And so the Spanish tell the Germans, hey, we found this British military intelligence officer, and he has this briefcase strapped to his wrist. Do you want it? And of course the Germans are like, yes. And so in that briefcase are plans to invade Greece, like an coordinated allied invasion of Greece. Now, Germany knew that the Allies were either going to invade via Italy or Greece. They knew we would be invading through France, but also either Italy or Greece. But they weren't sure which one. And so now they believe this information that says that the Allies will be invading through Greece. So they send more troops to Greece when in fact the real plan is to invade through Italy, which we will talk about a little bit later. So again, military intelligence, the British intelligence agency is hugely important to success in the European theater of World War II. Without it, the fighting would have been a lot harder, a lot more protracted, and had a lot more casualties, even though this is a pretty catastrophic war as it stands. So this brings us to D-Day, Operation Overlord. Also known as D-Day. D-Day stands for Disembarkation Day because the troops will be put on boats and ferried across from England, across the English Channel, and they will disembark in France, right? D-Day is massive. There are 5 beaches that need to be taken. You can see 2 by the British, 1 by the Canadians, and 2 by the Americans. Casualty rates vary across the different beaches, but in total, the casualty rates, you're looking at about 10,000 Allied casualties and between 4,000 and 9,000 German casualties, but they vary across the different beaches. So the United States will send in about 73,000 troops to these 2 beaches. All told, there'll be about over 150,000 troops sent in across all 5 beaches. It's a massive land invasion. It goes badly. The worst beaches to invade, Omaha's the worst one because it looks like this. So you're coming in across the water. You have to get out of your boat. Your boat might not make it all the way to the shore because there's military turrets and machine guns firing down at you. So people are going to get shot in their boats before they even disembark. If you disembark too early, you could drown because of your heavy equipment, and that is happening because it's chaos. The Germans see them coming. They're not seen as early because there's massive fog, and so that helps. But eventually, the Germans see them and they start firing. And of course, in Omaha, it's even worse because there's this sheer cliff face. It's not a flat, even beach. So the Germans have literally the high ground, and they're shooting down at the disembarking Americans. I will say that in other schools where I taught, we showed the D-Day invasion scenes from Saving Private Ryan. This is a Spielberg movie. It is made to be as accurate as possible. It was so accurate that World War II veterans had flashbacks after seeing it. So it's not to be taken lightly. It's rated R, and so I can't show it to you because you are freshmen and the school would not approve that. But someday, I highly encourage you to see Saving Private Ryan. It does a much better job of showing you what this invasion was like than I can do describing it to you. You can certainly find it on YouTube if you don't want to watch the whole movie, although the whole movie is quite good and worthwhile. So anyway, Massive. I mean, it's a major assault onto German-occupied France, but it also comes at a very high cost. Now, the troops are walking into much more resistance than they were expecting because the night before, paratroopers, people who are on airplanes and are dropped with parachutes behind enemy lines, were supposed to be dropped off the day before, and they were supposed to have cut communications lines and sabotage German sites so that it would be harder for the Germans to fight back against this invasion. However, because of this fog, it is a lot of these paratroopers wind up dropped way far away from what their targets were, and so they're not able to get to where they were supposed to be. They wind up not being able to meet up with their appropriate units. It's a pretty big mishap. That said, this fog is the reason that D-Day was actually almost rescheduled and called off. Now, the fog did help provide some cover for these invading troops, but it was a disaster for the paratroopers who were supposed to have been providing initial sabotaging of the German fortifications and communication lines. There will be plenty of veterans who do manage to survive this assault, and they will then start making their way into the rest of France and that it will start the liberation of France. Okay, to mark Peace Day in September of 2013, there was a major kind of art project, if you will, where stencils of bodies were put on the ground and the sand was rucked up in those stencils to mark the 9,000 people who were killed in this invasion. So you can see, like, the beaches are just covered with these stencils. You can go visit the beaches of Normandy. Normandy is still a place, for those of you who remember. It's why we call it the Norman invasion, the Norman conquest, William of Normandy, 1066 into England, all of that. This is Normandy. This is it's a place, not just a battle. Okay, so that is D-Day, a very short version of it. And again, I highly recommend, if you can get your parents' permission, or just someday when you're older and ready to watch an R-rated movie, that you watched the recreated footage. Okay, the Allied invasion of Italy. This actually takes place before D-Day in 1943. And again, partially successful because the Germans aren't expecting it here. They're expecting it in Greece over here. It has multiple parts, starting with the invasion of Sicily, which goes pretty well. There are certainly casualties, but the Sicilians are not really big fans of Mussolini. They don't really like his version of what it means to be an Italian. Remember, Sicilians have often been made fun of by mainland Italians, saying that they're not really Italian. They speak a dialect of Italian, and their cuisine is slightly different. They're much closer to, and they're close to northern Africa, so they're just considered less Italian. And so the Sicilians are perfectly happy to disobey Mussolini and his version of, like, what the Italian state should really look like. So after the invasion of Sicily, there's another invasion of mainland Italy. There's multiple parts here: Operation Avalanche, Operation Baytown, Operation Slapstick. Again, if you're a military history buff, there's plenty of resources out there that you can educate yourself. But for now, just know that there is an invasion of Italy. So the Allies are coming in through Italy, and then they're coming in through France. Oh, sorry about that. And then, of course, you've got the Russians fighting back on the Eastern Front. And so Germany and the Axis powers are being squished from basically three sides. Okay. The Italian invasion will be very successful, in part because of Italian-American troops. The Italian immigrants to the United States, which again had been looked down upon and told were not wanted, and by the Americans who already lived in America, are now suddenly useful, and their skills, their language skills, their children's language skills are being used to communicate with the Italian population, to get intel reports, etc., to help navigate the countryside, and to build rapport with the Italian citizens, right? We're not an invasionary force. Look at us. We're Italian too. We're coming in to liberate you. This is very different than the Japanese Americans' experience. There will be Japanese Americans who are allowed to enlist in the military, but they will not be trusted and will not be sent to fight in Japan or the Pacific Theater, because the U.S. government is extremely racist, and they do not believe that these Japanese citizens can be trusted to fight against what they consider what the U.S. government considers to be their true homeland. Again, it's a very racist understanding that, well, an Italian immigrant certainly could become American, or at least their children could become American, and we can trust them to fight in Italy and not be disloyal. But Japanese Americans, the children of Japanese immigrants who were never even allowed to become citizens, well, they certainly could not be trusted. They're certainly just by blood loyal to the Emperor of Japan, and therefore we can't send them anywhere near the Pacific. And in fact, we need to round them up in our own country and put them into concentration camps, or what we will call internment camps, and keep an eye on them. The government will say that that is for their own protection, but all of the guard turrets and the barbed wire is pointing in, not out. So again, there's a very different treatment that German Americans, Italian Americans, and Japanese Americans are getting at this time. Okay, ultimately in Europe, these invasions are successful, and it becomes clear that the tide of the war is turning, and though the war is not over yet, it's going to be over. The Allies are going to win. It's just a matter of time. Hitler is on the retreat. So there is a meeting at Yalta and then at Potsdam. So these are two places in Europe, two meetings where you have the leader of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, the leader of the USSR, Stalin, and then the leader of the United States, FDR, to plan out how to handle Europe after the war, right? What do we do? Do we just go home? Do we say, good luck, everybody, fend for yourself? Who rebuilds what? What resources are you allowed to take as the conquering army? What are the rules here? Because what they don't want is for this to just turn into a continued war once the American troops and British troops run into the Soviet troops. We don't want to see it turn into a communist capitalist war. So generally, the agreement is that you keep what you take. And that doesn't mean forever, but essentially whatever you liberate, you are responsible for rebuilding that territory. So you don't just abandon it, because if you abandon it, you're leaving the ground ripe for another fascist leader, or for the capitalist, another communist leader, to come in and promise the people equality or restore to their former glory or whatever it is, and it will just destabilize Europe even further. So that's not what anybody wants. So the argument is you keep what you take, and then you help rebuild a government, and then eventually that government becomes its own again, right? So France will not be under the control of the Americans forever. The big problem here is who gets Poland. Well, if you look at the map, the Soviet Union is what has liberated Poland. But the problem is that Poland is the very reason that Great Britain and France went to war. Right? They declared war on Germany because Germany invaded Poland. So are they going to be okay with letting the Soviets, the communists, their mortal enemies, aside from the Nazis, rebuild Poland? Is that the liberty that they were guaranteeing Poland when they declared war on its behalf? No, of course not. So this is a tough sell. But there's really no other way to do this. Now, this will become really tense when FDR dies. He dies before the end of the war. FDR believed that Stalin was somebody who could be worked with and trusted, at least enough that if you brought him into the fold, you could compromise, you could limit his excesses, that he wasn't looking to create a global communist utopia like Trotsky was, for example. He was looking to build communism inside the Soviet Union, and that we could then therefore work with him. But Truman, FDR's vice president, who takes over after FDR dies, he does not trust Stalin at all. He's extremely suspicious. He hates communists, and so it's going to make this even more difficult. And Truman is the one who goes to Potsdam, the second conference. He also lays out the basic principles. Potsdam is a follow-up meeting, and things are even more tense there. Ultimately, Germany is going to be liberated by both the allies from the West and the East, and so it will be split in half. This is where you will get East and West Germany. And Berlin itself will be divided into 4 parts. So Berlin is in East Germany. The Soviets will believe it should be theirs because they liberated it. But Berlin, as the capital of Germany, will be divided into 4 parts. And we will talk about that later when we get to the Cold War and the Berlin Wall and all of that. But this is what's leading up to that. Right? So all told, oh, there you go. Sorry. That's Germany being divided. So all told, you wind up with this breakdown when it comes to military deaths on the Eastern and Western fronts. And again, you should see here that the much heavier casualty rates are on the Eastern front, right, compared to the Western front. It's not to say that the loss of human life on the Western Front isn't tragic. It certainly is. But there are way more casualties. Which country has the highest number of military deaths in World War II in the whole world? The Soviet Union, followed by China. Again, this is just like in World War I with the Soviet Union, only at that point it was Russia taking the brunt. If you include civilian deaths, again, you're still seeing the Soviet Union far and away, followed by China. And we're going to look at the Pacific theater of this war in our next lesson. And then, of course, you have Germany, which makes sense. It's fighting a war at 1.3 fronts, right? So there you have it. Without the Eastern Front, the bottom line here is without the Eastern Front, the U.S. would have had to double its troop numbers in the West. Double the troop numbers in the West. Because the Soviets are putting up such a fight with Germany, Germany has to commit more troops to the Eastern Front that it otherwise would have been able to put against the Allied forces on the West. And therefore the United States' commitment would have had to been double to make the gains that the United States and Britain and ultimately Free France were able to make. You wouldn't know that from watching most American pop culture and movies because, well, first of all, we tend to focus on what we do. So, woo, America, right? The British are the same way. World War II is a major topic for them because it's an era where they're clearly the good guys here. There's clearly a bad guy. They come out triumphant. So Britain and America both really like doing World War II movies, learning about World War II. But the Soviets, without their impact, without their commitment, without them fighting, if Hitler hadn't broken that non-aggression pact, this is an entirely different war in Europe. But the Soviets don't get that credit. Why don't you think they get that credit? Well, because right after World War II, it will not take very long before the Cold War starts. And in the Cold War, Britain and the United States will be battling the Soviet Union. And so obviously they are not going to highlight the friendship that we had with the Soviet Union, this alliance, the commitment and the sacrifice borne by the Soviet people. That's not what they're going to be holding up because the Soviets are now the bad guys. It's the same reason I explained to you that Americans and the British often confuse fascists and communists and think that they're the same when they're not. But it's because the fascists will be the enemies and then the communists will very quickly become the enemies after the fascists are defeated. So, things that I didn't cover, even though this took us multiple days to get through, just the European half of the war. The French resistance I mentioned very briefly. And then, of course, I didn't mention the Yugoslav resistance, the Dutch resistance, even the German resistance from inside Germany. There will be people fighting against Hitler and the Nazis. Attempted coups and the assassination attempts on Hitler. Didn't mention. The invasion of Italy I mentioned so briefly. The African campaign in front got one slide. The Russo-Finnish War I did not mention at all. The conquering of the Scandinavian countries and Denmark I didn't. They were on the maps. That's it. The military tech and inventions. We've talked about tanks. That's really all I've given you. 98% of the battles. I didn't even mention the Battle of the Bulge, which is a massive battle. The war in the Atlantic and submarines and battleships and any of that. Nope, didn't have time to talk about that. I mentioned the name Rommel as far as generals and Montgomery. I didn't even really cover Dwight Eisenhower or Patton or many other leading military generals. There's so much in World War II. It's so expansive, and we haven't even talked about the Pacific yet. So if this is your pet history project, if this is the area that you love learning about, there are tons of documentaries and museums and resources and even still some veterans that you could talk to, and I highly encourage you to do so. But I rest assured that this is an area of interest for a lot of you, and you will further your education in this area if you so choose, whereas there are a lot of other areas of history that I'm quite aware you would not learn about if you weren't forced to, and so that is where I choose to spend more of our time. But we will be looking at the Pacific the next time you tune in. This is one more slide is just to talk about some movies I've mentioned so far. Casablanca, again, a classic. If you watch Casablanca, and I highly recommend it, you could watch it with your parents. It's a family-friendly movie, but it is. You might think it's very like cliche and has a lot of tropes that you've seen before, but that's because this is that movie. Like, this is the movie that other movies rip off and repeat and reference over and over and over again. So I highly recommend this movie, especially if you like World War II. If you're interested in old movies, have a certain style to them that really has this je ne sais quoi. It's got an element to it that I can't even really describe, but it has that in spades. And if you're a film buff, if you like World War II, I really recommend that one. Saving Private Ryan, like I said, rated R, so you might need to wait on that, but I highly recommend you watch that movie. The Imitation Game, also very good, really does a nice job of looking at how these codes were broken and the people at play there. And then Enemy at the Gates, if you're interested in that battle about Stalingrad. The Enemy at the Gates, I'm sure, is rated R. It is pretty graphic. So again, another one you might not want to watch right away, and certainly not without your parents' permission. So, okay, there's plenty of other World War II movies, and there's also movies dealing with the Holocaust, which we haven't actually really talked about yet. So, more recommendations to come. Okay, talk to you next time.